And then we speak two names. Little sentence to be removed. Let's go to Amanda then. It's also Henrique.
Are related to these are for all ask first for okay. Go to press exactly. Visited me. I smoked this today. Yeah, kind of an update class. Check this out. So I
So these guys.
Hi. I just want to introduce myself. My name is Craig. I'm a senior economist at Barros.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're going to start with our last session for today. If we're ready. Are we? Yes. So we magically somehow managed to be on time again. I don't know how, but congratulations to everybody who made an effort. I'm really happy to chair this interesting conversation. We have 3 fascinating papers that really range geographically the planet from Colombia to Mozambique and to Jordan. And our first speaker is Henrique Pita Barros. He's assistant professor at the Department of Economics at the Lisbon School of Economics and Management. And Henrique will present today on the power of dialogue, where he highlights the importance of intergroup contact and community meetings as mechanisms for promoting social cohesion between host and IDP communities in Mozambique. And I think we will follow the same model as the presenters before. The presenters will present for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll have questions in the end. But before we go to Henrique, let me also present our second speaker today, María José Urbina, who I hope is online. She is an economist and political scientist from the University of Los Andes, specializing in public policy with a focus on refugees. Today, Maria will focus on Colombia and present a paper looking at how the regularization of 500,000 Venezuelans in Colombia affected electoral behaviors of Colombians. So the same study that Sandra Rosso presented earlier today, but from a different angle. And last but not least, we will look at the MENA region, and we will invite Bailey Palmer to present evidence on a housing assistance program for Syrian refugees in Jordan, which evaluated the impact of rental subsidies and landlord incentives for housing improvements. And Bailey is a 5th-year PhD candidate in the Department of Economics at the University of California in Berkeley. And she mainly focuses her research on labor market issues in the Middle East. I also hope that she is online. And without further ado, Henrique, over to you.
Oh, yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. I'm very happy to share what has been my PhD work back at Brown for the past 2 years. The Power of Dialogue is a field experiment studying the use of dialogue to promote integration between IDPs and the host communities in the context of the ongoing insurgency affecting the north of Mozambique. And this work is motivated by the growing numbers of forcibly displaced individuals around the world. This, which has several implications. First of all, the social and economic shocks that are generated by the arrival of the IDPs, the refugees in those communities, and for also the people that are displaced. These shocks are known to produce negative consequences to both groups, the displaced and the hosts. This could have repercussions in labor and the housing markets, in food security, in wealth, which in turn could lead to tension and conflict between the hosts and the displaced individuals that could then undermine long-term socioeconomic development. So, given the first-order importance of this issue, there are, of course, many studies focusing on how to promote this integration between the displaced and the hosts. And we already saw some works today addressing this issue, and most of the work that exists actually takes what I call a resource-focused approach. And this tends to be some central allocation of resources, a cash program, a job assistance program, a provision of public goods, and in fact, most of these programs tend to be effective, are shown to be effective. We saw examples today of these programs being effective. The issue is that in some situations, these programs cannot be implemented because they often require significant financial resources or central planning that are not always available to the governments and international partners, particularly in lower income settings. So in this project, I try to take an alternative approach. I take a community-based approach using a community-based program that tends to empower the communities to drive this integration by itself. So this brings more flexibility in the answer that is being provided and tailors it more to the specificities of each local context. It also requires, this type of response also requires less type of central planning and financial resources. And despite these advantages, the efficacy of community-based solutions is still scarcely understood by both academics and policymakers. So with this project, I look at two main research questions. The first one is whether community-based intergroup interactions can reduce the prejudice against IDPs and promote their integration into host communities. And second, going more specifically into the context of Mozambique, I also ask whether intergroup contact can be effective in addressing the sources of this forced displacement, which in the case of Mozambique is the insurgency. Is the support for the insurgency, is the fact that people are creating this violence. So, the study is a field experiment that takes place in the provincial capital of Cabo Delgado, the city called Pemba. It studies social integration of IDPs and local hosts. This is a context that has been seeing an Islamist insurgency led by a group called Al-Shabaab, locally known as Al-Shabaab, this thing started in 2017. And at the onset of the project, there were more than 1 million IDPs in the region, roughly 43% of the population in the region that was displaced, according to IOM numbers. And in Pemba, so the research site, we had around 140,000 IDPs, so roughly 41% of the people living in Pemba was internally displaced. So the program consisted of structured community meetings that joined the local hosts and the IDPs, and these went along Allport's contact hypothesis. And in one sentence, we can summarize this hypothesis as, under appropriate conditions, intergroup contact can decrease the prejudice between the majority, so the locals, and the IDPs, the minority. Also, these meetings were not just random encounters where people chatted about anything. Instead of that, we had a meeting protocol that was developed by me in strict collaboration with the local community. This followed a structure of something called a public dialogue that was not created by me, but by an NGO based in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the topics covered were mostly related to the relationship between locals and IDPs, so daily life interacting with each other in Pemba, but also the experience of the IDPs escaping the conflict. I will detail this further on in the presentation. So going to the setting, here we have Mozambique, and right in the north of the country, we see where Cabo Delgado is. So, not sure if I can point. No, but it's right in the north of the country, bordering Tanzania. This is a map of Cabo Delgado. Each of the polygons is a district within the province. And the darker the color, the greater the incidence of the insurgency as measured by the number of attacks recorded by ACLED. And the pattern of the insurgency is IDPs coming mostly from the darker colored districts, and they find refuge in different places across Cabo Delgado, with one of the main ones being Pemba. Here we have like a satellite Google Maps cut of what Pemba looks like. It's not a very dense city. All these orange spaces are like the backyard of someone or some empty plot of land, and this is where we find the IDPs. They are mixed with the population in the city, so they are not in a camp nor anything like that. They are just mixed in the city. And given the high numbers of the high inflow of IDPs there, pretty much every space was kind of filled with IDPs. Here we have an example of IDPs living conditions. This is in a neighborhood called Maringanha. I don't know if anyone here already visited Pemba. It's usually next to the UNHCR headquarters and where UN agencies are. and where also there is also a good amount of IDPs settling. And even before collecting, survey data or running the intervention, when I arrived in Pemba, the first thing I wanted to understand was what was driving this friction between the IDPs and the hosts. And I ran some focus groups to try to understand these sources of friction. And several things came out. The first one was the different social habits of the IDPs. This was mostly related to an urban-rural divide of IDPs coming mostly from rural areas and hosts living in an urban area. These reflect ways of socially interacting and stuff like that. Then we have a very salient issue about the unequal treatment felt by the locals. So the World Food Program, for example, is in Pemba giving food aid to IDPs, or it was at the time delivering food aid, but only to IDPs. The hosts are almost as poor as the IDPs, and in their mindset, they don't understand why all aid goes to the IDPs but not the locals. So this was a very salient issue. Then we have an economic mechanism here, competition for access to the scarce public services. More people there competing for the same resources. And then there was some sort of discrimination against the IDPs where the hosts specifically associated the IDPs to being insurgents and associated them with violence. So this was kind of the setting that I encountered when I arrived in Pemba. After that, I started by running a baseline survey with the hosts and the IDPs. And here we have the answers of the locals, the local hosts in red and the IDPs in blue. And we see that at baseline, we see around 40% of the locals reporting that they associated IDPs with insecurity. We have around 30% of the locals thinking that IDPs should either be sent out of their neighborhoods, that the presence of the IDPs was negative to their neighborhoods, or that their living conditions got worse. All of this could be underreported, of course, because there is a social desirability issue here in reporting this information. Then we have an issue about treatment, a mismatch in perceptions. If we ask IDPs in blue whether they think locals are treated better than them, 30% of IDPs agree with this. If we ask locals the same question, only 13% of the locals think that they are treated better than the IDPs. So there seems to be some perception mismatch between the two groups. And finally, there are some issues with trust. And here we can see, for example, that the trust of locals towards locals is around 56%. Trust of locals in IDPs is 53%, very similar. But if we look at the IDPs, it's quite different. 62% of IDPs trust in IDPs, but only 44% of IDPs report trusting in the locals. So there seems to be here an issue with trust of the IDPs specifically towards the local community. Now, going to the intervention itself. This public dialogue can be summarized as a conversation in which people with different beliefs seek to develop mutual understanding. The setup includes a moderator. It has to be someone impartial and respected by both the locals and the IDPs. And I used individuals from the Islamic Council of Cabo Delgado, this kind of an NGO present in the region. This is overwhelmingly Muslim population. And one of the questions I had was whether the Christian minority would actually respect these Muslim leaders. And I consulted with all the community, and the answer was yes, because these leaders from the Islamic Council are also involved in the solving issues with the civic life of the city, even beyond religion. So there was a widespread respect for these individuals, and as we will see, these actually worked well. The meetings lasted for 3 hours, usually in the morning or an afternoon, and the target size was 8 to 10 participants, with trying to have an even split between locals and IDPs. In terms of the protocol, we started by defining the meeting rules, and this was to be able to make the Allport contact hypothesis hold, so the rules of engagement. And then we have a first component of go-around questions. All these the go-around questions were pre-specified in the protocol, and these questions were chosen by the community, the locals and the IDPs, as the most relevant issues to be discussed in the meetings. The moderator asks a question, then individuals take turn in answering the questions. These questions could be related could be, for example, asking locals, since the IDPs arrived in your neighborhood, how did your life change? Asking IDPs, since you moved to this neighborhood, how did your life change? Tell me one good thing about the locals, tell me one bad thing about the locals, and vice versa. So these were kind of the questions they picked. And at the end of this phase, the IDPs were also invited to voluntarily share their own stories escaping the conflict. These, of course, had to be totally voluntary, and this was by far the most complex part of the meeting, because IDPs would tell what really happened when they were fleeing and what insurgents did in many cases. This was also the component that resonated a lot with the participant. The second part was an open discussion where the moderator steps back and allows the participants to engage in a more organic conversation, following up on the points that were previously discussed. Here now we have an example of a community meeting. So people sit around a circle, so no privileged positions, not like I am right now facing you and you facing me. We have the moderator right there in the middle of the group. We also try to keep all the neighbors away. So you see those neighbors away. I like that picture because it clearly shows the neighbors are away. So this was to try to keep some privacy in the meeting and to make people feel more comfortable. And then people, yeah, they stayed in this conversation for those 3 hours. Now, in terms of research design, Pemba has several neighborhoods, and we worked isolated in each neighborhood. So all randomization, the entire intervention was done in an isolated way in each of these neighborhoods. For the sample selection, we used 2 methods. For the IDPs, IOM was kind enough to share the displacement tracking matrix with me, so I was able to randomize based on the DTM. So I got kind of a random sample of all IDPs in Pemba, very good. For the locals, unfortunately, there is no updated roster or data set of the locals, so we had to use the random walks. We get our sample for each neighborhood of the locals and the IDPs, and then we randomly allocate them into cohorts. And cohorts are these groups of 8 to 10 individuals that could either be a control cohort, no community meeting, or a treatment cohort engages in one community meeting. 2 to 3 days later, I measure short-term effects using survey data, list experiments, implicit association test, and 2 to 3 months after, I remeasure the things for medium-term effects. In terms of the outcomes measured, regarding the social integration of the IDPs and the hosts, I use a combination of survey questions and list experiments for the attitudes of locals towards IDPs and the social integration, and for religious tolerance and preference for insurgents, so the support for the insurgency. As you can imagine, I cannot ask people if they support the insurgents. No, it would be dangerous and people would not be honest in replying, so I had to come with a more creative way, and in these cases we do the best as we can given the situation. So the best I could find was to use this newly designed graphical list experiment and the implicit association test, and I will try to describe this further in this presentation. Then, in terms of the kind of non-survey outcomes that are being used, for those of you that are not familiar, the list experiment works as follows. Participants are read 4 non-sensitive sentences, like I don't like the roads in Pemba, I don't like paying taxes, things that are not socially sensitive to say. And then half of the sample is randomly selected to be read an additional 5th sensitive sentence. And for the locals, this 5th sensitive sentence would be, I do not like that IDPs are living in my neighborhood. And for the IDPs, the sensitive sentence would be, I feel discriminated by the local population in this neighborhood. And then the answer to this list experiment, individuals are asked about the number of sentences with which they agree, but not with which sentences they exactly agree with. And in this way, the experimenter never observes what are the true preferences of the individuals, but because of this randomization, we can still compare the means of those that were shown 4 or 5 sentences. Now, starting with the results on the social integration. I'm showing coefficient plots. What we see are the treatment effects of those that participate in the meetings in comparison to those that were in the control group. In the vertical axis, we have that vertical line at 0 for 0 effect, basically. And what we can see is that first with the tolerance towards IDPs, let me just describe the outcomes. The first three outcomes, tolerance, beliefs, and trust, is based on survey data. And the fourth outcome is the list experiment that measures discrimination. What we can see also is that in blue we have the short-term effects, so after the meeting, and in red we have medium-term effects in the follow-up 2 to 3 months after. What we can observe is that shortly after the community meetings, the only thing that is changing is the tolerance. Locals are becoming more tolerant towards the IDPs, but nothing else seems to be moving. But if we actually look now at the medium term, we see that in the medium term, beliefs about the IDPs are becoming more positive. Trust in the IDPs is improving, and discrimination against the IDPs, as measured by the list experiment, is decreasing. Now, there is an issue of why tolerance is not observed in the medium term. The effect on tolerance seems to fade away. And then in the paper, I argue that there are really concerns about spillover effects to the control group. And if that's the case, it's difficult to observe then a treatment effect in this medium term. In terms of the IDPs, we see that the IDPs report feeling better integrated right away after the community meetings, with the effect persisting in the medium term. They report participating more in the neighborhood life, so in the civic life, in the decisions of the neighborhood right after the meetings, but this effect fades away. And the community meetings are not really about governance and not about them making decisions. It's how the average IDP interacts with the average local. And this could be related to that. Then we have this issue with trust that we saw at baseline that existed, and we see trust of IDPs towards locals improving and persisting. And finally, we see a decreasing discrimination of feeling discriminated by the local community right after the meetings, and then the effect becomes more difficult to identify in the medium term, arguably because of sample attrition. We have around 20% of the IDPs that are treated 2 to 3 months after because of the high mobility of this population, so it becomes more difficult to track them. Regarding religious tolerance and the support for the insurgency, the graphical experiment works as follows. Instead of reading out loud 4 or 5 sensitive sentences, I showed images. And this was because culturally it was not acceptable to spell the word Al-Shabaab or terrorist. People would get scared. So the solution I came with was show images instead. Some people were shown 4 non-sensitive images, and then there was a 5th sensitive image of Al-Shabaab taking a town called Kisanka in Cabo Delgado, I think in 2020, a very well-known image for the population there. And half of the sample was shown that image. And then people are asked with how many images they agree with. And that could be from 0 to 4 for those that were shown 4 images, or 0 to 5 if they were shown the 5th sensitive image. For the list experiment, we had María José talking about the list experiment earlier today. I will not go a lot into that, but we used images, and we divided images into 4 categories. Sad faces, happy faces, pictures of the government of Mozambique, in this case this is the president of Mozambique, and pictures of Al-Shabaab. And then we ask individuals to associate happy and unhappy images with the concepts of government and with the concepts of insurgents. And then the way this works is, well, there is an algorithm at the end that computes how relatively faster individuals associate happy things with authorities and sad things with insurgents. And if they make this association faster, they are said to be more biased towards authorities than insurgents. And if they associate faster unhappy things with government and happy things with insurgents, they are said to be relatively more biased towards the insurgents. These are not, of course, perfect measures. They are. This can be argued, as in the previous presentation it was said. But again, this is a very difficult context to gather information, and this is kind of the best, or among the best things that we can try to do in such context. This is a participant completing an implicit association test. And finally, the results here. So what we see is that regarding religious tolerance at large, and these are just survey questions showing preference for freedom of religion, we only see an effect with the IDPs in the short term. And then when we look at the preference for the insurgents, first with the implicit association test, we see that in the medium term, the preference for insurgents of the IDPs, as measured by the list experiment, as measured by the implicit association test, decreases. And if we look at the locals, we don't see any effect with the implicit association test, but we see a decreasing preference as measured by the graphical list experiment. So how to interpret two things here? First thing to interpret is why do we only observe effects in the medium term in this case? And then there is all this literature in psychology of radicalization that says that, deconstructing strong beliefs is a lengthy process that would be unlikely to take place 2 to 3 days after the intervention. So that could be an argument for only observing these effects in the medium term. And the other point to make is why does the list experiment work for the locals and not the IDPs, but the implicit association test works for the IDPs and not the locals. And it has to do with what each instrument is capturing. The list experiment is self-reported. Locals have to be aware of their preferences when they report liking less the insurgents. The implicit association test can measure, or is supposed to measure, unconscious beliefs that IDPs may not even be aware that they have when they are reporting this information. So this could be the mechanism. So, to wrap up, let me highlight 3 key takeaways from this presentation. The first one speaks to the intergroup contact literature. And this project shows new evidence that short but tailored intergroup interactions can have the potential to generate effects that last at least a few months after the intervention. And remember, this was a very short interaction of 3 hours. Second, this project makes a first application that links intergroup contact to the process of counterinsurgencies and de-radicalization. The project does not fully explore what are the mechanisms behind, but tries to but it makes an initial attempt of linking the two issues. Lastly, speaking more to the policy world, this project shows that, presents new evidence that community-based approaches can be effective in fostering this integration between hosts and IDPs. This can offer a new type of policy tool that can complement other tools that governments and international agencies already use. And that it could be relevant in that regard because it's cheap and easy to implement and can be delegated in the communities without that need for the central planning. So right now I'm working on a spin-off project of this. So I'm studying, I collected a new sample and I ran this intervention for 1 year and I'm trying to understand the marginal return to contact. Is it always better for people to interact with each other, or is there a point upon which it's no longer beneficial to keep people interacting? That's a question that we still don't know the answer. I am also measuring spillover effects. So the first time I got there, the authorities there did not fully trust me to start collecting spillover data. Now they do. They allowed me to rerun that I'm doing. And then the government of Mozambique is also interested in turning this community meetings program into kind of a policy to be rolled out in the region of Cabo Delgado. So at the end of this year, I'm planning to run a workshop to capacitate the government in running this intervention in the region. And I'm also now working with the returnees, the IDPs that are returning into their homelands where there are serious issues of social cohesion of the neighbors including the relatives of the victims of the conflict, but also the relatives of the insurgents themselves, all these people living side by side, and how we can break this grievance cycle and avoid conflict from perpetuating. And finally, I have to thank my fantastic staff that works under very difficult conditions in Pemba, and I still work there now. And trust me, it's very difficult to collect data in such context. And I always like to acknowledge this fantastic team. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henrique. That was fascinating. I took a lot away from my own project, which is great. Let me turn to María José Urbina, who should be online.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
And I think we can also see your presentation.
Okay, I will share the presentation.
And while she pulls up her presentation, I realized I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Julia Lendorfer. I'm at the World Bank here in Abidjan. Okay, over to you.
Okay, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is María José Urbina. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conference. I'm honored to be here today. So, today I will present the document, Electoral Effects of Integrating Forced Migrants, Evidence from a Southern Country. To begin with, there is extensive evidence that support a correlation between migration inflows and voter support for anti-migrant political parties and less support among natives for redistributive policies. This evidence is
Maria,
principally
sorry
focused.
to interrupt you. Can you just get a little bit closer to the microphone? Maybe it's a bit difficult to hear you.
Okay, let me check.
Thank you.
Headset. Now it's better?
Yeah,
Hello.
perfect. Thank
Better?
you.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, great.
So, okay. And so I will start again, so maybe it's better. So to begin with, there is an extensive evidence that supports a correlation between migration inflows and voter support for anti-migrant political parties and less support among natives for redistributive policies. This evidence is principally focused in the global north, with a few exceptions in the global south, which is relevant since 85% of forced migrants are housed in developing countries. Considering all of this, stepping into the shoes of a politician may help explain the resistance of politicians and political parties to take actions that will facilitate migrant integration. In fact, we asked to elected officials, what will you do when faced with a huge and sudden surge of forced migrants? He answers us, of course, I want to help Venezuelan migrants. We are all migrants in some way, you know. I'm just worried about the response from my people. The political backlash could be difficult for my party. His answer was, of course, it highlights the importance of understanding the electoral effects of easing migrants' integration, particularly in the global south. So this paper contributes to 3 strands of literature. And first, to the studies evaluating the political effects of immigration on host economies. Also adds to the literature concerning the impacts of migration reforms. Most studies in this area have examined the impacts of amnesties on labor market, but specifically in the global north and not about electoral reforms. Our work also contributes on how humanitarian interventions affect voting behaviors and attitudes toward migrants by analyzing how programs with no direct benefits to hosts affect native voting behavior in the short run. So to summarize, our main contribution is that we identify the electoral impacts of migration reforms instead of migration itself. Additionally, we implement a survey to shed light on the mechanisms behind the results. I will explain it later on. So, as my co-author Sandra Rosso explained in the previous presentation, Colombia is the main recipient of Venezuelan migrants. By August of 2024, 7.7 Venezuelan migrants had to flee the humanitarian crisis in the country. Approximately 3 million are settled in Colombia. So despite the size of the migration flows, the Colombian government has been so generous, granting these migrants free mobility and opportunities to regularize their status. One of the largest initiatives was the Permiso Especial de Permanencia, PEP, program that they launched in 2018. I will pause here to explain the program. It is implemented in 2 parts. First, between April and June of 2018, the Colombian government conducted a nationwide survey to count the number of irregular migrants. This survey was known as the RAM, Registro Administrativo de Migrantes Venezolanos. In July 2018, the President Juan Manuel Santos unexpectedly offered a regularization program to everyone who had registered in the RAM survey. To be eligible to apply for the program, the migrants needs to be in the RAM registry, also be present in Colombia at the time the decree was issued, and also lack of a criminal record or a deportation order. 64% of all migrants who registered in the RAM received the PEP visa between August and December. The PEP was a generous amnesty. They give to the migrants legal migratory status for 2 years, work permit, access to the health and education system and childcare services, and also access to financial services. So, until now, to wrap up, PEP program impacts cannot be estimated by comparing electoral outcomes in municipalities with different program take-up. This is because migrants vote with their feet and consider the characteristics of each place when deciding where to receive. For this reason, we employ a difference in difference methodology, where the temporal variation comes from PEP rollout in 2018, and the cross-sectional variations comes from the actual program take-up. So in other words, what we do is we examine the causal effects of the PEP program by comparing election results in municipalities with higher and lower PEP take-up rates before and after the program's rollout in 2018. Here is the main specification. I will try to go fast from this slide. So M stands for municipality, which is the equivalent of county in the United States. Department, which is the equivalent of a state in the United States. T, election year. The Y represent the electoral outcome of interest, in this case, electoral turnout, percentage of votes for left-leaning, center, and right-wing, ideologies, and electoral competition. C is a vector of municipal characteristics at baselines. It includes conflict, violence, public finance related variables, poverty and inequality, economic growth, and previously regularized population. All of these are measured at the baseline before the migration, before the PEP program was carried out. We interacted the baseline controls with the election year with an indicator indicating each of the election years. Also, we include the election years fixed effects, department time trends, and municipal fixed effects. And the data we use is the PEP take-up. We have all the Venezuelan migrants who apply for the PEP program. And in the electoral data, we have for the mayoral elections, 6 municipal elections between 2000 and 2019. And for presidential elections, we have 6 municipalities elections from 2002 to 2022. And the different sources to get all the municipal baseline controls. So to have valid estimates from the difference in difference, we have to check for the parallel trend assumption. So these figures illustrate the coefficients of an event study that excludes the election closest to 2018 for the 5 electoral outcomes we studied. The red line point the 2018 where the PEP launch was carried out. As we can see, we are not able to distinguish any violation in the parallel threat assumption before the 2018. Additionally, this is for the mayoral election and this is for the presidential elections. Here, we can see the main table where we estimate the difference in difference model for mayoral election, panel A and panel B, and presidential elections, panel C and D. The only difference is that the panel A and C show the treatment variable is continued, and panel B and D, the treatment variable is an indicator variable equal to 1 when in the municipality there's a positive value of PEP take-up. As we can see, we are not able to identify changes in any of the electoral outcomes we studied. And we further test the robustness of our main results by exploring the effects of a similar but larger regularization program offered by the Colombian government in 2021. This program scales the PEP benefits to any Venezuelan migrant who arrived in Colombia before January 2021. The program grants the same benefits as PEP, but is more than 6 times larger. The results confirm that the voters had no reaction to migrant regularization progress in Colombia. And more important, suggests that the negative effects observed for PEP program were not driven by power issues. But we still have the question, but do voter reactions to migration flows differ? Although Colombian voters showed no response to migrant regularization programs, they reacted strongly to Venezuelan inflows, as reported in previous studies, such as the one of Rosa and Barros.
María, we're losing you again. It's very hard to hear you. You come in and out.
Oh my
Just
God.
try to stay closer to the mic. Thanks.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry for that. I will try to talk louder. So, the authors in this agenda have concluded that larger Venezuelan inflows increase voter turnout and shift votes from left-wing to right-wing political ideologies. We update the results. We are update the data with the new data available to replicate the estimates in previous papers, and with the new data we confirm the results. Migration inflows translate into higher voter turnout and shift of votes from left-wing to right-wing ideologies. And we evaluate our main findings. We evaluated the robustness of our main findings to a series of empirical exercises, and our results remain unchanged. First, we changed the functional form specification for the treatment variable. We did it as an indicator, logarithmic, and hyperbolic sign transformation, and the results remained the same. Additional, since we found a statistical difference in some of the static baselines outcomes, we tested the validity of our main results to a matching difference in difference and produced similar results. Moreover, we checked for violation on the parallel trends and assumption, and the results remained unchanged. And finally, we examined heterogeneous treatment effects, and there's no difference in impacts in municipalities with high and lower program take-up. So to sum up, our results suggest that Colombian voters did not change their voting behaviors in response to migrant regularization programs. Um, so we aim to understand this precisely estimated zero by exploring the mechanisms that could explain these results. So we have two hypotheses. Lack of information about the PEP program, because we were only able to find 120 news articles related to PEP program by the major Colombian news outlets in 2018. Or indifferent to arrived migrants. We have hypothesized that the effects of immigration on voting behavior is largely driven by voter concerns about the economic impact of migrants upon arrival or potential future inflows, rather than by policies affecting migrants once they are in the country. And this is evident from the deceleration of the Venezuelan inflows in Colombia after 2018, that the inflows remain steady. So to test the validity of these two challenges, we conduct an in-person survey experiment in Bogota to shed light. So I will stop in here to explain the experiment. So we randomize the sample into groups, one control, one treatment. We include 1,040 Bogota residents from 21 years old, because we took into account that they were able to vote in 2019. And we showed these pamphlets. So everyone have to read. 4.6 million Venezuelans have been forcibly displaced, and 4 of which 10 live in Colombia. And the control group, in addition, has the following statement. 281,000 irregular Venezuelan migrants have been legalized through the Permiso Especial de Permanencia, which grants them a work permit, access to social programs, such as subsidized health regime, and access to financial services. This is some pictures with the experiment. Okay, so after we show the pamphlet with them, we then collected information on their attitudes toward migrants, including a list experiment and a detector game to measure altruism, voting intentions, political views of some migrants, and general knowledge about the program. So here I'm showing the table that displays the balance between the treatment and control groups, and it confirms that the randomization was done correct. And the experiment's results showed that even after treated participants received information about the program, there were no changes in prosocial behaviors or voting intention, if any, for our camp. Here are the tables. What I want you to notice is that although the coefficients are small, they are generally bigger than 2%. This suggests that the lack of information, this suggests that the lack of significance is not due to statistical imprecision. Our sample size was designed to identify a minimum of at least 2%. So we were not able to voting intentions, social capital, altruism, and different attitudes towards migrants. So to conclude, we were not able to identify an impact of the PrEP program on electoral effects. Also, we were not able to conclude that this result is driven by voters' lack of information. We speculate that the voters response to inflows, but not to policies that affects migrants after they arrive, since the inflows are controlled. And also, as Sandra explained, the results are in line with previous work documented that the PrEP program not induced negative effects or labor or crime outcomes. Some key recommendations is promoting regularization policies is crucial, as evidence shows no adverse effects on native voting behavior. Policymakers can expand and sustain these initiatives, which have been shown to support economic and social integration of migrants. And we can complement these efforts with public communication strategies to address concern about job displacement and crime and fiscal impacts, and let know people that the refugees really does not impact that much. And next, public awareness to prevent this political backlash and increase the popularity among politicians of this kind of programs. And that's it.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Maria. And I really recommend reading this paper. I think it's fascinating, and there's so much rich policy advice or ammunition for policy advice in this paper to be used. Now over to Bailey. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and I think we see your presentation as well.
That
You
might
can make
still
it
be-
bigger.
Oh shoot. Okay.
Oh no, sorry, that's still Maria.
Yeah.
Does she need to stop sharing? Here you are. Now we can see you.
I think oh shoot. I think I may need to leave the talk briefly to allow myself to share my screen. Maybe I'll do that really quickly and come right back. Sorry.
Please do come right back. Should we take the time to maybe ask a question to Maria, since we still have her? Yeah, I see a hand in the back. But you need a mic. Can someone help her with a mic?
Sorry, my question is actually for Henrique, if that's okay. Henrique, this was really interesting. Thank you so much. My name is Nessa, and I work for IPA, and I come from the peace building implementation space, though, and I think I wrote a lot of proposals that assumed that like these really light touch interventions could actually change attitudes. And so this is exciting for me. But I think coming to IPA, I've become much more skeptical of that, especially given so much of the social cohesion literature and conflict affected spaces indicates that attitudes are really hard to change. The effects that do happen often dissipate really quickly. And I agreed with you. And I think that peace building field believes this too, that attitudes do take a while to move, but I wonder if you could speak to why you think such a light touch intervention led to these medium-term outcomes, because that was a result I was really curious about, and I think like the programmer in my heart is rejoicing, and I'm curious what you think that relationship is.
So that's a super good question. I can only speculate about the reasons too. And while running the intervention, it was also unclear to me whether the results would be negligible or positive or even negative. There were reasons to believe that it could work, going back to the contact hypothesis, but that the matter would be if really a light touch thing could produce results. My speculation is that the key here was to use this type of protocol from the public dialogue that uses what the community, that lets the communities define what is relevant for them. It's not the experimenter coming and thinking now you need to do this type of program, and you do the program. Of course, I go there and ask them to participate in a meeting. That part, I ask them to do something. But then all the content inside that meeting it was pre-specified by the community as the thing relevant to them. In terms of the effects, I have that slide in the appendix, but if you correlate the average of the effects I find, which are about 0.2 standard deviations, you plot that the median effect size with the length of the contact, and you put also like survey literature by Paluk and co-authors, or Matt Lowe's paper with the cricket, or Salma Musa's paper with soccer, and so on. They actually all fit in a line. There is a linear fit that fits all of them, and this project also fits in that line. So it's kind of all makes a bit of sense when we plot that. I was also surprised when I got to that. That's a very nice linear fit, and I'm happy to show that also later. Yeah.
Thank you. So Bailey, we took the opportunity to have a small discussion, but maybe we turn over to you now before delving into the real discussion.
Amazing. Thank you so much. My apologies for the technical difficulties. Can you hear me now? Is everything good?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. So I'm really pleased to be presenting this talk. We've titled it Housing Subsidies, Life Outcomes, and Social Integration, using experimental evidence and forecasts from Syrian refugees in Jordan. This is joint work with a very large team, including Sandra Rosso and Emma Smith, who are at the conference currently. So feel free to chat with them in person afterwards. Okay, so I don't need to do much work in the way of motivation, given the incredible talks that we have already seen so far. And so we know that forced displacement is a problem that's affecting more and more people in today's world, and crises are becoming increasingly protracted. So 80% of refugees today have lived in host communities for over 5 years, and half of refugees globally live outside of camps. And this is especially true in Jordan, our setting, where 85% of refugees are living in a host community, and therefore they're renting housing in the private market. And despite the fact that rent is such a large part of any household's budget, and particularly a refugee household budget, we really don't know very much about how to make sure that refugees have access to safe and stable and affordable housing when they're renting in sort of the same housing market that everyone else is in. And so this study examines impacts of a housing subsidy for Syrian refugees in Jordan. And just to dive right in, we evaluated the Norwegian Refugee Council's urban shelter program, which was a program that ran from 2019 to 2021 that provided two main components. The first was housing upgrades or repairs that included things like mold removal, securing windows and front doors if they didn't have a lock, installing doors to bathrooms, or covering bare floors. And all of this occurred in the refugees' current residence. So I want to emphasize that unlike other programs that may help people move to better houses or better neighborhoods, this program was focused on promoting stability. And so it occurred in the refugees' house that they were already living in. And the other component of this program was 9 to 18 months of free rent that was transferred directly to the landlord. And so this on average totaled to around $2,200 US. And the last component of this program was that the landlord was required to sign a contract with both NRC and the tenant. And this was, part of the goal here was to promote stability, although ultimately I'll talk more later about how this really impeded take up. Okay, so we conducted a randomized control trial of around 2,200 refugees that were split equally between treatment and control, and we randomized at the community level. And our primary focus, which was pre-specified ahead of time, is on both refugee well-being along multiple dimensions and social cohesion and the attitudes of host neighbors towards refugees and how that responded to this program. I'm sure I also don't need to give a ton of context here, but so we're working in Jordan, and the Syrian refugees in this setting fled the country after the start of the Syrian civil war. which began in 2011. And since then, over half of the population, sort of the pre-war population in Syria, has been displaced, with over 5 million people being displaced abroad. And in the sort of immediate early stages between 2011 and 2015, things were very chaotic. Refugees didn't have access to affordable work permits until 2016, when the Jordan Compact was signed, which, among other things, gave refugees access to work permits in certain sectors. And today, in 2024, there are over 600,000 registered Syrian refugees in Jordan, which is approximately 5% of the population, like the total population of Jordan. And Syrian refugees are not the only refugee community in Jordan. There are still some Iraqi and Yemeni refugees. And as I'll talk about more in our later on, we conducted a survey of Jordanian neighbors of refugees in our sample, and 12% of those Jordanians had grandparents that were born in Palestine. And so essentially, many of the Jordanians in this setting are descendants of refugees. And so forced displacement is a very salient issue in this setting. And ultimately, the results that we find in this program are fairly disappointing, but I think it's really important to understand the rationale of trying out a subsidy and how sort of reasonable that was at the outset. And so in this setting, this is work that Sandra Rosso, our co-author, has worked on. Refugees are facing very high housing prices. She showed that the influx of refugees in Jordan post-2011 led to a rise in local rental prices. And so relatedly, refugees are carrying a very high rental debt burden. So NRC conducted a survey before they started this program, and over 70% of refugee households have reported holding rental debt, and the average level of debt was almost 500 USD, which is sort of a staggering amount. And because of this, people in this setting are experiencing a lot of housing instability. So 40% of people in that survey reported moving at least 3 times per year, and 1 in 10 was under immediate threat of eviction. And so not only is this a huge financial burden, but you can also, it's not difficult to imagine how, like the psychological burden of being so unstable, especially for someone who has already experienced forced displacement. And so this was sort of the rationale of why a housing subsidy might be important, just to help people financially, but also could have larger impacts. So our main contributions of this project are providing experimental evidence on this program, on the effect of housing subsidies, on a wide range of life outcomes. We also measure the impacts of the program on host attitudes towards refugees in a setting where there are many different vulnerable groups, including just like poor Jordanians. And I won't go into this in depth in this short talk, but we also collected expert forecasts. So we surveyed a sample of policymakers, implementers, and research to understand what their priors or like expectations were for what this program would do. And sort of in brief, people on average expected small but positive impacts on refugees of this program and null impacts in terms of social cohesion. And we actually end up finding like the opposite. So I think that's super interesting. So this program was implemented between 2019 and 2021. So it was occurring during sort of a brief lockdown period in Jordan. In 2020, we conducted a midline phone survey, and then at endline, after most people had completed receiving the subsidy, we conducted a really detailed endline survey, and then we conducted a phone survey in sort of winter of 2022 as our kind of like follow-up survey round. And then in the summer of 2022, we also conducted this neighbor survey that I mentioned before. So we visited the household of each refugee in our sample, and then randomly contacted or randomly interviewed a Jordanian neighbor in that immediate vicinity, like the closest neighbor we could find. We randomized at the locality level in the 2 governorates along the border with Syria where most refugees live, and this is a figure of our locality level randomization. In terms of targeting, NRC conducted a vulnerability assessment before the program began that was focused on housing vulnerability in particular. And so the middle 80% of vulnerability scores were eligible for randomization, and so were included in our study. The 10% most vulnerable, according to that score, always received assistance and was excluded from our study since they were not randomized. And then the 10% least vulnerable were also not randomized and did not receive assistance since they were not so vulnerable. Our randomization was successful in the sense that we're balanced on 16 out of 18 baseline outcomes, and we cannot reject the null that treatment and control are the same. And then in terms of take-up, we had surprisingly low take-up, and this goes back to that landlord comment I made before. So despite the fact that this is an incredibly generous program, only 32% of households that were randomized to treatment actually received the program. And the main reason for this is that landlords were sort of not keen on entering into a contract with NRC and the tenant, since most rental agreements are informal in this setting. And given how sort of behind on rent these people were on average, I think the landlords were not excited to, unfortunately, lose the right to evict them. And so despite the fact that that was sort of the goal of the program, it ended up being a kind of hurdle towards take-up. And then because of this low take-up, we focus on treatment on the treated estimates. We had pretty high contact rates, so 90% of our treatment group was surveyed in one of our 3 refugee rounds, and then 82% of the control group was surveyed, which are pretty high contact rates. That gap between 90 and 82 is statistically significant, which could theoretically introduce some bias. So we conduct leave-ins in the paper, and I won't have time to get into them now, but they're available in the paper. So ahead of time, we wrote a pre-analysis plan where we pre-specified 5 primary outcomes for refugees that we would focus on. The first 2 are housing quality and housing expenditures, which are sort of direct impacts we'd expect to see from the program. And then the next 3 are total consumption, which is the total amount of money that households are spending on everything, which is usually better measured in this context than income. And then adult depression and child socio-emotional well-being measured by the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which was administered to a child aged 3 to 8 in the household, if there was one. And then we have a long list of secondary outcomes that we measured. Basically anything you can imagine. So food security, employment, credit and savings, marriage and fertility, et cetera, et cetera. And then for our neighbor outcomes, we also pre-specified 4 primary outcomes. So the first is policy preferences. So that's an index of the extent to which host community members have like pro-refugee policy preferences, like on work permits, integrated schooling, stuff like that. Economic attitudes is an index which reflects the degree to which host community members feel like refugees are good or bad for the economy, essentially. Social attitudes is an index that reflects the strength of social ties and just like social attitudes towards refugees. And altruism towards Syrians was measured in like a incentivized altruism game. And so also in our pre-analysis plan, we decided to report refugee impacts from each round separately, each round of our surveys. And then we also decided to pool outcomes that were measured in multiple rounds to try to increase power, since we are a little bit underpowered because of that unexpectedly low take-up. And so the interpretation of that pooled outcome, the sort of pooled treatment effect, is the average effect over the time period that those surveys were conducted. Like I mentioned before, our preferred specification is a treatment on the treated design, and we adjust for multiple hypothesis testing since we have hundreds of outcomes. So now I'm going to dive into the results. So this table reports the pooled treatment effects of the program on refugees. So panel A reports treatment effects on the primary outcomes. So over all 3 rounds on average, we saw no impact on housing quality. We do see a reduction in housing expenditure at inline, which is consistent with the program. We saw no effects on food consumption or total consumption, no statistically significant impacts on depression over, like on average, on all 3 rounds. We do see a reduction in child well-being. So children on average over these rounds had lower levels of socio-emotional well-being in the treatment group. And then panel B reports a few of the other outcomes that were not primary, but we saw statistically significant impacts. So treatment group households were more likely to have at least 30 JD in savings, which is around $100 PPP. And then we see these really large and unexpected increases in hunger in the treatment group. So, for example, the control mean in the mean in the control group of hunger is that 39% of control households went to bed hungry in the past month on average over those rounds. And we see an 18 percentage point increase in the treatment group in that hunger level among respondents, and similar outcomes for other adults in the household and children in the household. And so this is really unexpected that a subsidy could have increased hunger. And I'll show you the round by round results that sort of help us understand how this could have happened. So at midline, which was our survey done while people were still receiving the subsidy, we see those same increases in hunger, and we see a reduction in food aid. So it appears that by receiving this large rental subsidy, households may have been kicked off of the food aid that they were receiving, and this probably is what resulted in the increase in hunger. We also saw an increase in the number of older children in the household, so presumably nieces and nephews moving in, and that may have also contributed to the hunger increase by having more mouths to feed. The survey was conducted in 2020, and we see increased COVID symptoms in the treatment group, which is probably related to the increased household size. More positively, we did see improvements in housing quality, which is like at midline, which is good. It means that the program was working, at least in the short run. And we see a reduction in the number of loans taken. So it does appear that, at least for some people in the treatment group, the program did kind of alleviate some of the financial burden that they were under. By end line, which was after the subsidy had ended, we continue to see an increase in savings, which is consistent with it sort of alleviating that financial burden. We also see a reduction in chores and childcare hours. So that's hours in the past week that the respondent spent on domestic work, essentially. And this might be consistent with no longer having mold in your house and having a lock on the door. Maybe those sort of housing quality improvements make domestic work less burdensome, which is good. However, at inline, we see a reduction in self-reported happiness. And then at follow-up, which was approximately 2 years after the program, the only significant impact is a decline in child socio-emotional well-being. And this is obviously quite disappointing. And based on the timing of these results, I think the neighbor results will really help us understand how this could have happened. So just to review, we visited each refugee household and then randomly selected the closest Jordanian neighbor to that sort of household that received the treatment. So panel A reports the primary outcomes that I explained to you before, and the only statistically significant outcome here is a reduction in social attitudes and perceptions. So this means more negative social attitudes towards refugees. And panel B reports some of the components of this index. So for example, we saw, in response to the question of the 3 people that you exchange advice with regularly, how many of them are Syrian refugees? We saw a large reduction in that. And we also see a reduction in the number of children in the neighbor households that have Syrian refugee friends. And when we conducted heterogeneity on these impacts, they were strongest for neighbors that were geographically closer to the refugee household, and they were stronger for people who did not have Palestinian grandparents. And so all these facts combined to us suggest that this was really like a resentment story, that because these refugees are living in working class neighborhoods, their neighbors are also low income people, but they were not eligible for the program. And so it seems like this may have weakened the social ties between neighbors, and this can also help us understand why our refugee respondents appear to have these long run negative like happiness effects. So in conclusion, what was the impact of this program? We saw that by improving housing quality and reducing expenditures in the short run, the program did achieve its goal in a very narrow kind of short run sense. However, we saw that large reductions in food security and negative impacts on child well-being that persisted after the program ended, and it also worsened social cohesion with Jordanian neighbors, and it was concentrated among kind of the people that were most prone to experience resentment, so those closest to the refugee and those that didn't have a kind of family history of displacement. Why did this happen? We think that the reductions in food aid that we saw meant that housing security may have come at the expense of food security. And because the program was relatively visible but not available to needy Jordanians, it may have created resentment. And so what can we learn from this program? I think the first thing to take away here is the low take-up that we saw with this program. So landlords in this setting were not keen to enter into a program that would have increased contract formality. And so while NRC wanted to increase stability and formality in contracts are a good way of doing that theoretically, because people do have to like consent to enter into a contract, it can reduce take-up. The food security results, I think, really emphasize the importance of coordinating aid provision. And I do want to stress that NRC prioritized this. And so they made sure not to kick recipients off of other NRC programs. And I know that policymakers in Jordan, really like this is a priority for people to coordinate aid, given the number of humanitarian actors in Jordan. But our results, I think, emphasize the need for continued prioritization of coordination, especially if you want to achieve the desired impacts. And then the last takeaway is just thinking holistically about social cohesion. So this program was designed to improve relationships between refugee tenants and landlords, but ultimately it backfired among neighbors. And so while this is a gargantuan task, I think it is important to try to think broadly and holistically about the wider social cohesion impacts that any given program could have. That's all I have today. I'd love to receive questions now or via email, and we're really grateful for IPA Peace and Recovery funding and research support budget funding from the World Bank. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Bailey. I think this was a really rich contribution also towards negative impacts that programs can have, that we really need to learn from. And also kudos to, I think, IRC who implemented this. As it's not always easy to then learn that your program is actually having negative impacts or none at all. So I think that's a really, really important learning agenda. Okay, the floor is open for questions. We have 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Please go ahead. I'll collect a few.
Hi, thank you. My name is Caroline Latin from IPA. I had a question for Maria. I'm wondering, given the indifference that was measured around voting or among voters, I'm wondering if you have any policy takeaways around politician rhetoric. Obviously, integration of migrants can be a pretty divisive issue, and so I'm curious if there were any lessons on what we can take away about how this was discussed either in the media or among political leadership.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Thomas, I saw.
I
Hold
think.
on, we're gonna collect a few questions and then we'll turn
Okay,
over to you, okay? Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Another question for Maria Jose. So I'm wondering if when you told people in the experiment that about the new policy, if they weren't aware, did you, and apologies if I missed this, did you collect what they expected the effects on the host communities to be? Like, did they expect negative effects on labor market outcomes or on housing or something like that, or positive effects from refugees being better integrated or whatever? And if, it's a correlation, but splitting some of the means by what people's expected effect from these programs was, then on their sort of policy support, I think would be pretty interesting. And then Bailey, quick question. I'm just wondering, in any of your surveys, did you collect whether the neighbors know that the refugees got this program? That seems like that would be a sort of intermediate step that would help the story. Thanks a lot.
I think there was one more question in the back, the gentleman.
Ok, merci beaucoup. Moi, je vais parler en français. Timbelou Seydou de l'OIM. Donc, je voudrais réagir sur la présentation de Henrique. Donc, je tiens d'abord à saluer cette très belle présentation. Donc, quand on regarde la situation au nord de la Côte d'Ivoire avec l'afflux de déplacés du Burkina Faso, c'est exactement le même schéma qu'on retrouve en fait. Donc, la communauté haute et les réfugiés qui n'arrivent pas forcément à cohabiter. Alors, dans votre exposé tout à l'heure, vous avez dit que les résultats montrent des effets à long terme. Donc, est-ce que vous avez pu identifier, n'est-ce pas, des actions qu'on pourrait mener en priorité pour accélérer l'arrivée de ces effets positifs-là? Merci.
Okay, one last question. Oh, there's so many. There's one behind you first, sorry. Okay. Go ahead. So who wants to?
So I have a question for Maria and Sandra. So I compared the result that you got on the impact of the arrival of Venezuelan refugees on voting for the right and the left. And apparently you got the same result that papers on migration to rich countries get. So when migrants arrive, the right does better. But I think the interpretation is completely different, because in this case, am I right? It was the right that implemented this approach to migration. So I think it's important to point that out. And I wonder whether the right benefited because people seeing the refugees got scared about the left and the left populism. So that's the first point. And also related to that, I think maybe for the first part of the analysis, try to differentiate according to the political position of the region. So it might be that you're going to get much more action if you differentiate by the past voting share for the right or the left, when you look at the impact of the reform on voting outcomes. So it might be, for example, that on average you don't get an effect, but polarization increases. That the effects are there, but they're different and opposite for people who are right-wing and people who are left-wing.
Thank you very much. Maria, over to you. Good luck. I hope you remembered all the questions addressed to you.
So, for the second question, we do not collect baseline expectations about what what they expect about the program. So you have a point. It will be super interesting to see it. And I'm afraid we don't have. About the first question, Sandra told me that she would answer it. And
Thank you.
the
So
third,
yes, on the
okay.
thanks, María José. On the communication. So I think one important issue to understand here is that at least Latin America or many countries, I also know there is a paper by Yang Yang Shu that shows the same for Africa. Migration is not as polarized according to political parties, and so for that reason, it was easier, let's say, for this policy to pass. It specifically was the right that approved the regularization of the migrants. And so the left didn't have any choice, because how are they going to, say, oh, this is a terrible thing to help, vulnerable migrants. So in that sense, I think that was very helpful. And another thing that was very helpful is that I think Africa has similarities to this. There were so many problems going on in Colombia that Venezuelans are not the most salient thing. We have a conflict that was resolving, and there was a peace referendum going on at the same time that this was happening. There's drug trafficking. There is all sorts of problems that are more salient, and the media has kind of left that issue aside. So I think it would be more challenging in countries like the global north, where migration is so demonized by the media. And I think that would be more challenging in those contexts to make that, more, to pass these laws, essentially.
Thank you, Maria. Did you still want to come in?
Yes. And for the last question, yeah, as you point out, I think in Colombia, the migration, we have the same result as the global north, but I think actually it's the same reason. Like the people the migrants arrive into Colombia, and right-wing parties support more restrictive policies for the migrants to get jobs and not compete with the host population. And I think it's exactly the same that happened in Colombia. And also we don't want to have this kind of regimes like the one they have in Venezuela, for example, because you see that the migrants are coming from a left political system, so the people punish these type of policies. I don't know if I am answering your question.
I see nodding, so I think you're good. Thank you very much, Maria. And then there was one question to Bailey, I think regarding of whether the Jordanians were aware of the housing subsidies, no?
Correct, yeah. So unfortunately, we did not ask this question directly of neighbors, since it's a little difficult because you'd also have to ask something in the control group, So we didn't ask directly whether or not neighbors knew about this particular program. We did ask the refugees if people in their social network knew that they were receiving this program, and in general, I think those responses were that in general people did know. But I think the most salient piece of evidence we have here is that we did ask the Jordanian neighbors how much on average they believed refugees receive in aid per month. And neighbors that were neighbors of the treatment group, those responses became more accurate. So it seems like we can definitely say that neighbors in the treatment group have a more accurate understanding of how many dinars each month the average refugee receives. And so it's consistent with neighbors being, well prized of this program, but we don't have any direct evidence towards that.
Thank you so much. And I think I remember reading in your paper also that refugees would have preferred direct cash transfers, no, rather than housing subsidy, as it would have been a more discreet delivery of benefits I thought that was quite an interesting fact, really. Okay. Last but not least.
My turn, okay.
Yes.
So I must apologize because the translation, I think it only started after a few sentences, but I think I still got the meaning of your question. So your question was about long-term effects and about outcomes that resonate more into like real-life outcomes. Is that correct?
And he also asked how you can get these effects quicker. No?
Okay. Well, that starting with the effects, getting effects quicker, that I don't know, but that would be a very good research question to study, but perhaps could be another paper. Regarding long-term effects, the implementation of this project faced an issue after these medium-term effects that I described in the paper. And the issue was that there was a sudden increase in mobility with the IDP population. So attrition started to increase as IDPs were moving around Cabo Delgado, and it was difficult to keep track of them. So initially in the pre-analysis plan, the idea would be to run an additional round of data collection. But given the attritions I was already finding 2 to 3 months later, I decided it was not cost effective to continue with that data. Now, with the new sample that I collected later, so the project that I told you that I already collected the data, I did that effort. I was able to do that at a period where the IDP mobility was more stable. And I'm looking at other types of outcomes like labor market integration and networks in a deeper manner than what I measured in this paper. Yeah. That's basically it.
Thank you very much. We've reached our time. So thank you so much to the speakers. That was a fantastic session. So over to you, Aisha.
Hello. Thank you. I guess you'll agree with me that it's been a very long day. So thank you so much for bearing with us. It's just like, yes, exactly. So you'll agree with me when I was saying earlier, that the quality of the paper that was selected, you've got a gist of this, very interesting question, super relevant finding and policy recommendation. And then you've seen, good news is like we're seeing traction. You've heard many of the policymakers that spoke that they are using more of this to be doing, development planning, to looking at programming, to really responding and having an impact. So tomorrow we are going to be delving more into this. How do we actually make sure that we're bridging this gap? So tomorrow morning, because we know everybody's exhausted now, tomorrow morning we are going to do a recap of today. I know it was a lot of information to digest, and thank you so much for sticking around. More exciting things happening tomorrow, and see you tomorrow. Have a good rest of your evening. Thank you so much.